there's so much to be done on the long list of things for any chief sustainability officer that I think that we need to go back to basics and say, well, which ones are going to fly actually across the business. Now, maybe there are some initiatives that are going to be easy to get past because they're going to save money. And there are some that as a CSO, you believe are necessary. It is sensible for most CSOs to think about how they start bundling those sorts of initiatives so that across their roadmap, they have some things that are just going to save money. They have some things that are maybe actually going to cost a little more money. They have a bunch of stuff maybe that they're pushing to suppliers and expecting suppliers to own the cost in return for maybe more volume and longer term contracts. And on the whole, the full program is more or less net neutral cost-wise. I'm Saif Hameed, and this is the State of Sustainability podcast. If you like what you hear on our podcast, please join us in Chicago for the State of Sustainability Summit, where we discuss all the topics that we cover on our podcast and more in person. The sign-up link will be in the show notes below.
Sustainability is at a critical crossroads where it faces both growing momentum and increasing scrutiny. Balancing profitability with responsibility is not a new challenge, but as the initial wave of sustainability momentum begins to stabilize, some organizations are reassessing their priorities, leading to tighter budgets and more focused resource allocation. Today, we'll explore the challenges sustainability faces in 2025, the arguments for aligning it with business interests, and how leaders can reframe their approach to ensure sustainability drives both long-term resilience and value. Saif, welcome.
Hey, Izzy, how are you doing?
Saif, do you want to kick off by actually just maybe setting the scene a bit? And I'd love to ask you what trends are emerging in sustainability right now and how the landscape is changing, and also what the primary drivers are behind this change.
It's a crazy time. I think the new US administration has come really tearing out of the gate on a lot of topics. And I think that has catalyzed a lot of movement elsewhere as well. Where to begin really. But let's kind of say first, ESG as a whole is clearly under attack versus where we were a couple of years ago. And I don't think there's any dispute around that. If you just look at the impact of that, before we get into environment, social governance, etc., you just look at the whole ESG topic, and you look at kind of how financial institutions are pulling back from coalitions and asset managers are pulling back from coalitions. GFANs is a great example. You just have so much kind of stepping, so much of a step back on the overall ESG level. And I think there's a very clear correlation, which is not just the new US administration federally, but also just actually a fairly concerted push by state level governments across the US as well, through legal action and otherwise. And so I think that's kind of one thing that's happening. That's like a trend that's not new. It's been there for a couple of years. The second is, now if we start going into each of the buckets, right, let's take social. I am somewhat surprised by the vehemence of the attacks on DE&I work. But it is quite startling to see. I'm kind of hearing about the US government requiring individuals working for the federal government to inform their superiors if they find anyone working on DE&I topics. There's a lot of this sort of stuff where it's almost just being vilified. I'm seeing a lot of chatter on LinkedIn and elsewhere on social media. There's just this vilification of DE&I people happening and DE&I work, which is just a bit surprising. And I think that is almost the poster child right now of this anti-ESG movement is DE&I, even more so than anything related to the environment or climate change.
Is that just in the US or worldwide?
I'm not really seeing it in such a big way elsewhere. I think this was true actually even a couple of years ago, even in the private, even in the market, basically in conversations with businesses and companies, I was noticing a much more adverse reaction to DE&I in the US.
Why is that? What are the causes for that?
Why does everyone hate DE&I? I don't know if it's as much an anti-DE&I as a sentiment that people don't care enough about me or enough about my problems or enough about the side of the community that I'm on. And I think that kind of silent majority is now expressing itself and asking for more attention and effectively making an enemy or a victim of the other side.
Yeah. So this podcast was going to be around why sustainability is on the back foot, but actually, sustainability in recent years has gone through a boom of trending, a lot of focus, a lot of money going onto it, a lot of shareholder value coming off it. D&I has kind of been left behind in that boom.
No, I don't think so at all, actually. I think DE&I barely existed 10 years ago as a topic. Like, it was a fringe topic in 2013, 2014. I remember McKinsey did a piece of work called Diversity Matters, and it became a series of research papers done with extensive interviews. I think those started coming out in 2015, 2016, 17, and so on. There was like multiple installments. And I was a part of some of that work. And it was a new big topic, and it came on the scene in a big way. And many of the companies that we worked with at McKinsey wanted to talk to us about it and wanted to take the topic seriously. And there were already some poster childs in the US of companies that were doing this well. Like Salesforce, I remember, was a good example of a company that was considered by that research to be doing DE&I well. And so I do think DE&I has been a big beneficiary of like this wave of focus on ESG as a whole. And we should talk about this emerging distinction between ESG and sustainability. But I think we're just seeing now this backlash where you have people applying for jobs that are encouraging applicants from diverse backgrounds to apply. And I think the applicant who's not from a diverse background is just thinking, well, who's going to hire me? Why don't I get any preferential treatment? And I think there are a lot of such individuals out there that are making their anger felt. And you and I can talk about how diverse teams are better teams, that deliver better economic output for society, that deliver more well-rounded communities, that deliver better business impact as well. But I don't think that resonates so much with the people who are trying to get a job and their friends and loved ones and families. And that's a sizable part of the voter base, which is, I think, what's driving a lot of this.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on your slight hatred for the confusion of ESG and sustainability and ask you to unravel those terms for us.
Yeah, so I think that the history of these terms is like long and not so long, but more tortuous than long. Like, I think that both terms kind of really came onto the scene in the late 90s in the corporate world in a big way. But today, ESG in general is a term that is used more as some form of a screening or rating framework, and it's generally used more by investors, analysts, sometimes banks, etc., asset managers. Sustainability has tended to be the term that is more often used to describe how a business approaches its own improvement program when it comes to particularly the environment. And so within that, we tend to focus on things like double materiality type topics from an environmental standpoint, the impact that I have on the world and the impact I think the world is likely to have on me. There are elements of like, how does this dovetail with long-term business viability and so on, and sustainability from that standpoint. But sustainability tends to be, from my perspective, much more operational, and ESG tends to be a little more moralistic in some ways. And I think partly that's because most of the environment side can be boiled down to numbers and quantitative data and comparison points and spectra of options. Like, your emissions could be bad or good or great or anywhere in between, with respect to many different benchmarks. Whereas your approach to human slavery is unlikely to be somewhere on the spectrum from bad to great. Like, you either have slavery in your value chain or you don't. You either have child labor in your value chain or you don't. It's not that you have a few units of child labor and that's okay, but actually don't let it get higher than that. And I think that's why ESG tends to be a little more of a moral viewpoint. I think sustainability is also under some level of pushback. And I think that we're going to see that in terms of both a tightening of commitments and progress by the more forward-leaning larger companies. So I think that they are going to use the current zeitgeist to lower ambition and center ambition around fewer topics that they think they can excel at. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, we can talk about it. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And then I think there's going to be all these companies on the outer edges that are going to kind of melt away, basically, as they find that they don't really need to be in this tent as much as they thought, or right now, or at all, basically. So I think that's going to be a big shift. And then on regulation, we're seeing actually quite a concerted pushback against a lot of the regulation that came in over the last couple of years. So, for instance, there's a movement to revise CSRD requirements, and kind of phase in certain requirements, water down certain other requirements over the next later this year. And over the next couple of years. So there's a lot of this happening as well that's going to be interesting to see play out.
So we've spoken about regulation as a point of why people don't need to be in this camp. What other points are actually pulling people back from sustainability?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is sustainability conformant with capitalism? And I think that's a debate that's being had right now quite widely, because with the new administration in the US, we are entering almost deep Darwinism. And you can actually see this with this debate over Greenland, for example, where the US is in a position where they can say to Denmark, we want Greenland. And we basically will now just watch this play out. And I think there's a reasonable bet that actually the US might get Greenland out of it. It's similarly, you kind of look at the US extraditing, I think, or deporting individuals to Colombia, and Colombia refuses to accept those individuals. And the US then says, well, fine, we've slapped on a set of emergency tariffs and trade restrictions onto Colombia that are going to take effect immediately because you're not playing ball. And this is kind of like almost like a deep Darwinism, right? This is like we have the ability to assert ourselves. We are going to go ahead. We are the dominant species in this engagement, in this relationship. And I think that the capitalist equivalent of that is like, if you kind of look at Milton Friedman, and you talk about business as purely existing to maximize shareholder value, do we actually, there's this view that actually, like, all this sustainability stuff, as long as you're not breaking the law, you should do what you need to do to make money for your shareholders. And I think that is an argument that we're kind of seeing now resurface. It had sort of not quite gone into hiding, but there was this talk about stakeholder capitalism, and how actually there's many different stakeholders that you need to account for, not just shareholders. And I think that is now also on the back foot.
So can sustainability be compatible with Darwinian capitalism?
I actually think that there are multiple grounds on which it can and is. I think the first is environmental sustainability comes from an awareness that there is not enough resource to go around. Everyone who is dependent on the material world, buying things that are grown, that are mined, etc., has to acknowledge that there is some limit to this. And actually, the rate at which we're consuming resources is not compatible with an indefinite growth scenario. And so the first thing is just like any business that is concerned about long-term viability has to take some measures to act on that principle. Like, however they want to react to it, like, that's for every business to kind of figure out. But there is this is a clear sustainability imperative. The next thing is that the physical world is changing, and you don't have to. All you have to do is agree with the science, actually, that climate change is happening, and that unpredictable weather events are going to become more frequent. There's going to be a higher probability of lethal heat waves than in the past, extreme precipitation events than in the past, etc., etc. And that's going to be another source of impact on business. And it is in the interest of shareholders for companies to identify those and start to take actions accordingly. You can add on a third reason, which is, for many companies, there are sustainable consumers, or consumers who value sustainability, that they should start to think about when it comes to how they position their products, how they communicate, how they develop consistency in brand narrative. All these things are going to be important as well. And that's before I even get to the question of whether sustainability can go hand in hand with any cost savings. I don't mention that one specifically because I find it's often overblown or overcalculated. But there are multiple reasons why sustainability is totally compatible with a hardcore capitalist agenda.
I like that. And maybe the last one, which I mean we've spoken about before, but regulatory pressures, even if they are diluting, they still are there.
For sure. And the thing is, you can have you can go ahead with the regulatory pressure because it's there, or you can try and get some advantage out of it. And like European digital passport is going to be a good one, right? Like you can comply with regulation, or you can kind of say, well, I'm going to have to do that anyway. What can I build on top of this? What value can it bring to me? How can I use this thing that I'm going to have to do anyway to create new value for shareholders? And I think the same is true for sustainability regulation. We're seeing lots of great examples of this, actually, where companies that are working with us because of CSRD or otherwise are finding that actually having great oversight into their data landscape can identify opportunities that they might have missed. We had a great example just a couple of months ago about someone identifying gas leaks that had a meaningful cost impact because they're monitoring the emissions data, and it was the sustainability team that identified this leak. So there's a strategic way to approach what you would have to do anyway.
But how can sustainability leaders actually reframe their approach then to better align kind of with this capitalist interest, especially as we spoke about before, like resource constraints, targets kind of being diluted down, et cetera, et cetera?
I think everyone in sustainability needs to talk about the business case. Why does this make sense for business? Why are we doing this? Like, that's where you kind of need to start. You need to start with the purpose, and the purpose has to be aligned with shareholder value. And there's a world where we say, actually, there should be another purpose outside of this. There should be actually the fair share of every business. There should be a science-based trajectory for the corporate world so that we don't all, end this life in flames. At the same time, like, we just have to acknowledge that's not where we are at right now in the corporate dialogue. And maybe it's not going to be for several years and maybe ever, right? Maybe actually the only way that we can ever get to be science aligned is actually another big regulatory intervention, because the inertia of the corporate world is always going to be very strongly towards shareholder value. It's too deeply rooted in the hearts of capital, at the core of capitalism. So I do think that the main lesson or learning for every sustainability team is focus on the business value. Whatever it is that you want to do, bring it back to the business value. Bring it back to the value for shareholders. There is a case to be made, and that's the one you should make.
And so if you were advising a CSO today, or anybody in sustainability, what would you tell them to prioritize in the next few years to ensure that sustainability drives both business value as well as have long-term resilience?
I think that it's like some of this is old and some is not so much new, but some has additional emphasis, let's say. Where if you were, like the way that you would identify initiatives in any real strategic exercise is you'd say, there are dozens of things I could be doing. Which of these things are easiest and which of these things are most valuable? And let me ideally do the ones that are easiest and most valuable, basically, that, meet those two things. And I think that there's so much to be done on the long list of things for any chief sustainability officer that I think that we need to go back to basics and say, well, which ones are going to fly actually across the business? Now, maybe there are some initiatives that are going to be easy to get past because they're going to save money. And there are some that as a CSO, you believe are necessary. And I'm not saying necessary ideologically, but necessary maybe for consistency, necessary maybe for table stakes, right? It's just kind of you have to get it done. You have to, let's say, you have to get a new emissions management system in place, and it is in your interest that that system be better and more automated and more flexible, because that's going to make life easier for your team. But maybe it's an expense beyond, let's say, the cheapest version of the setup, for example. So that, and you have that. But then you also have stuff that is going to be an easy sign off for a CFO or a CEO, because it's just going to straight up save money. It's a transition to lower volume packaging formats, and you're going to save money on packaging just by weight, for instance. It is sensible for most CSOs to think about how they start bundling those sorts of initiatives so that across their roadmap, they have some things that are just going to save money. They have some things that are maybe actually going to cost a little more money. They have a bunch of stuff maybe that they're pushing to suppliers and expecting suppliers to own the cost in return for maybe more volume and longer term contracts. And on the whole, the full program is more or less net neutral cost wise. I think you kind of want to almost take that program for budgetary sign off rather than approach things one at a time or year by year, because the trap you risk falling into then is you get sign off on all the stuff that makes money. The other stuff gets kicked down the road and you'll never get sign off for it because it'll never save money.
And so one last question is around stakeholder versus shareholder and what the relative weighting you would apply to both in terms of, we've spoken a lot about shareholder value, but I guess there's a lot of stakeholder value that can be generated from sustainability. How would you manage both of those groups?
This is kind of actually the fault line between the two arguments right there, which is if you are going to take if you are going to kind of take a straight and narrow view of capitalism, you're not going to acknowledge all the other interests of these stakeholders as being important. Because you're basically going to say, look, my interaction with my consumer is shaped by the price the consumer is willing to pay and the volume the consumer is willing to buy. And there are elements of like, how loyal is the consumer? How long is the consumer going to stay with me, etc. But these would typically be baked into how you build your brand. This is goodwill value, for example. And this idea of saying, well, actually, am I doing good for the community? That this is, an intangible and I can't actually account for it in goodwill on my balance sheet. And I can't actually extract it in terms of price that I'm charging, but I know it's there. I know it's a value to society. This, I think, is pretty much at the core of the fault line that we're talking about. And I think we're kind of seeing this also with things like science-based targets. Like, if there is a delta between what the business needs to do from a target perspective to avoid losing brand credibility, to avoid breaking the law, to avoid pissing off its talent base, to avoid, in short, doing any of these things that would destroy shareholder value, I think there is today a challenge, which is to say the business shouldn't do anything more. Actually, most businesses aren't aiming to beat the goalpost on things like regulation, and I think a lot of the same thinking will start to be brought up in this space over the next few years.
So 2025, this feels quite depressing, but you think maybe then it's going to be a scaling back of ambition and instead looking towards the lower end of the spectrum at what is the minimum input, maximum output?
I think 2025 is definitely not a scaling up of ambition across the business community. And I don't think it's flat on ambition. And therefore, I think it is definitively a scaling down of ambition. I don't think there's any two ways about it. At the same time, I think that ambition was at unrealistic levels a couple of years ago. Like, there was no way that a lot of the commitments that we were seeing out there were ever going to be realized. So, I'm kind of disheartened as an environmentalist, right? Like, there's a wistful part of you that wishes the world was rational and able to act in concert to avoid creating these massive externalities that are ultimately going to mean that we breach 1.5 degrees easily. At the same time, from a business perspective, I feel like 2025 is probably just going to result in a more pragmatic place for business. And I kind of hope that that things don't get watered down too much. But actually, for business to arrive at a place that business thinks is long-term viable from a sustainability standpoint, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Well, Saif, I think that is what most corporate sustainability professionals are going to be grappling with themselves this year, the ideological versus the business. So it's going to be a lot of pondering and big thoughts and recalibrating. But any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered all the bases, Izzy.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Saif. And thanks everyone for listening. Goodbye.
Thanks all.